Thank you. And welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see you here at the first public seminar of the BroKIC series in 2022. My name is Professor Heidi Haugen, and I'm at the University of Oslo, where we have the project Brokering China's Extroversion, of which I'm the principal investigator. And we started this seminar series instead of having physical seminars under COVID. The format has been that we have the authors of 2 books discussing their work with a discussant. And the works are from very different fields, but they have in common that they talk to how Chinese and foreign actors are engaging with each other and who are the brokers in these processes. You can find the previous seminars online, and Christian will post a link to the previous seminars in the discussion field. So that, and it's been nice to see that these seminars have lived on after we have concluded the talks and been spread, and the discussions are ongoing through the videos that we put out. So because they've been successful, although traveling has picked up now in Europe, we decided to continue them into this semester. And I'm very happy today that we have Dr. Don Murphy with us, Professor Adam Grydehøj, and Professor Ping Su. They will be introduced further by Zeno Leoni, who's a teaching fellow at King's College London and who will moderate today's discussion. So over to you, Zeno.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and I'd like to thank Siv and the University of Oslo for having me here today. I'm very excited about this webinar. It's very promising. It's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to explain why. But first of all, yes, I was teaching fellow until very recently. I'm a lecturer, doesn't change much. In war studies, I'm based at the Defense Studies Department of King's College London, within the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom, and I'm also an affiliate to the Lao China Institute of King's College London. My research lies in the area of US-China relations, and more broadly in the, from a conceptual point of view, it focuses on the liberal international order, its crisis, and globalization theory. So I said a few seconds ago that this is going to be a very promising seminar, promising webinar and discussion. I think the interesting aspect of it, well, there are 2 interesting aspects. First of all, these are 2 very fascinating books themselves, but then I think it's also interesting to explore, and I think that's what I'll try to do. That's what we try to do, to explore the relation between these 2 works and the tension between them. I think they will provide some similarity, but in a way also 2 very different pictures of China. And I think this tension between these works is very timely, because it comes at a point when we see this sort of constrained competition between the United States and the West on the one hand and China on the other hand, which probably it's leading us towards 2 competing world orders, at least in some areas, in some niches of the world economy, certainly. We just need to look at how, on the one hand, President Biden's Build Back Better World, B3W project, and Xi Jinping's Common Prosperity campaigns, somehow they are informed by a logic of decoupling, although we will see whether there will actually be some decoupling between the US and China, between members of the G7 and China. As always, these broad frameworks seek to achieve, these 2 policy frameworks seek to achieve different things, but certainly decoupling is a very important theme in it. So I think we should listen carefully to the individual presentations, but also try to reflect on how they interact with one another, and especially during the Q&A. So I'm going to present the authors again. On the one hand, we have Don Murphy, who is an associate professor of international security studies at the US Air War College, so in a military institution like myself. She's going to present a book titled China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative World Order. On the other hand, we'll have Adam Grydehøj and Ping Su. They're both professors at the Research Center for Indian Ocean Island Countries, based within the South China University of Technology. And they're going to talk about their book titled China and the Pursuit of Harmony in World Politics, Understanding Chinese International Relations Theory. Right, before handing it over to Don Murphy, I just wanted to remind the audience that they can pop their questions into the chat, and I will read them after the two presentations will be completed. These presentations will last about 20 minutes each. Then I'll probably ask a couple of questions, and then I will open it to the audience. Thank you very much for being here, for listening. Don, I'll hand it over to you.
Can you hear me?
Absolutely, yes.
Great. Good morning, and thank you for having me. First, I do want to give a general disclaimer that today, what I express are my own views, not the views of the US Air War College, Department of Defense, or the US government. I want to first discuss the overall argument of the book, which is, although China does not seek to change the international distribution of territory in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, as its power grows, it increasingly competes with the US, builds spheres of influence in these regions, and challenges the rules of the international system by constructing an alternative international order to facilitate interactions. China does not seek to replace the existing international order at this point, but if the current order unravels or excludes China, this alternative order could serve as the foundation of China's economic, political, and military relations with the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as much of the rest of the developing world. The book seeks to answer the following questions. What are China's interests in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa? Is China competing or cooperating with the US in these regions? Is its behavior converging or diverging with the liberal international order? Is China building alternative international orders in this region? And if yes, what are the characteristics of that order? How does China portray itself as a great power in these regions? And ultimately, what does China's behavior in these regions indicate about its rise globally? First, I want to define a few terms. When I discuss the Middle East, I'm referring to the League of Arab States plus Iran, Israel, and Turkey. So it's a very broad definition of the Middle East. And when I speak of Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm referring to the rest of Africa outside of North Africa. Also, in this work, I chose not to characterize China as revisionist or status quo, but for each foreign policy tool that's examined in the book, I look at the degree to which its behavior is competitive or cooperative with the US, and the degree to which that behavior either converges or diverges with the liberal international order. One of the main findings of the book is that as China's power grows, it's competing in certain functional areas, specifically economic and political areas. And that behavior often, although not always, diverges from the liberal international order. But in contrast, in the security realm, China overall in these regions is cooperating, and its behavior mostly converges with the liberal international order. Another important finding is that as China's perception of threat from the US increases, it amplifies its competitive and norm divergent behavior. Now I want to briefly discuss China's interests and the foreign policy tools that are discussed in the book, and then I will move on to categorizing those as competitive, versus cooperative, and as convergent versus divergent with the liberal order. So China's interests in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa are acquiring resources and markets to fuel China's domestic economic growth, fostering support for China in the international system in an era of emerging multipolarity or bipolarity, potentially, ensuring China's own domestic stability. And what I mean by this, primarily this is in relation to the Middle East, wanting to ensure that Middle Eastern governments do not criticize China for its behavior in Xinjiang specifically. The next interest in these regions is advocating for developing country causes, as well as safeguarding China's citizens and businesses abroad. And finally, an emerging interest in these areas is protecting China's territorial integrity and sovereignty from the US. And what I primarily mean by this is it wants support from states in these regions regarding its interpretation of sovereignty and a desire for non-interference, as well as increasingly wanting support for its stance on issues in the South China Sea, Hong Kong, and other international issues. Next, I want to discuss the foreign policy tools, and I'm going to do this in a very high level, of course, during the Q&A. Happy to discuss, much more detailed issues associated with these. But the primary foreign policy tools that are examined in the book are China's cooperation forums, special envoys, as well as bilateral mechanisms in the economic, political, and military spheres. So first, cooperation forums. Many of you are probably familiar with these. They have the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, also called FOCAC, that was established in 2000, that includes 53 states from the continent of Africa, all states except for Eswatini. So all the states in Africa that recognize the PRC versus Taiwan. And then you have the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, and that is with the League of Arab States, and it was established in 2004. These two forums are the primary multilateral mechanisms that China uses to interact with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. They cover a broad range of functional areas: economic, political, foreign aid, security, health, education, environment. I'm going to focus on a few aspects of this, but they really are very holistic. Almost any way in which two states interact, these forums have in scope for their activities. The political norms underlying both of these forums are the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, most importantly, sovereignty, non-interference, and non-intervention. Another very important political norm is South-South cooperation. And in the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, another very important piece of political interaction is support for the Palestinians in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In the economic sphere, the norms tend to revolve around a heavy state involvement in economic activity, and there's a very broad range of economic issues that are covered: trade, investment, infrastructure, economic security, energy security, etc. Foreign aid is also in scope, as well as security cooperation, but security cooperation compared to economic and political cooperation is less emphasized. But there are issues associated with supporting peacekeeping, nuclear free zones, a desire to combat terrorism within regions, etc. But this really is not the emphasis. Part of why I stress this is compared to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is another cooperation forum, these and China's cooperation forums globally tend to focus on the economic and political, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization started with a much more security focused organization that then evolved into having more economic and political components. So those are the cooperation forums. The next major foreign policy tool that's discussed in the book are special envoys. China, at the writing of this book, China had established 3 of these in these regions. One in the Middle East in 2002. And the purpose of all of these envoys is to contribute to peace and security in these regions around specific hotspot issues. So the Middle East envoy has primarily been focused on contributing to resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. There was an Africa Envoy that was established in 2007, that really centered around wanting to resolve Darfur, and over time evolved into looking at issues associated with South Sudan and other broader issues related to security in Africa, but those have been the two major issues. And finally, in 2016, they established an envoy for Syria, and that has been focused on attempting to contribute to resolution of the Syrian civil war. Other foreign policy tools discussed in the book, in economic relations, I look at state support for Chinese companies, foreign aid, special economic zones. And the way to think about these special economic zones, for those of you that are familiar with China, it's very much a model similar to how China initially used special economic zones for their own development. They've been establishing these in a number of countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East in order to promote primarily small and medium-sized enterprises from China entering into these markets with potential spillover effects into the local economies. They've also, on the economic front, pursued free trade agreements, in particular with the Gulf Cooperation Council, Israel, Palestine, as well as Mauritius. And they've also established a number of agricultural demonstration centers. These are primarily in Africa rather than the Middle East, and it focuses on transferring various types of technology associated with agricultural products, soy, corn, rice, etc., sharing that with the local with the local state, and also providing an opportunity for China's businesses in that sector to establish themselves. On the political front, I look at UN Security Council voting. And the two particular areas that tend to come out in my research are issues around sovereignty. So I look at the degree to which China's voting in the UN Security Council and the US's voting diverges. And so the two main areas where that occurs are sovereignty, particularly around sanctions, and then votes associated with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's the two areas of divergence. I also look at strategic partnerships, and I think many of you are familiar with these. There's definitely been an uptick in the establishment of strategic partnerships under Xi Jinping and with the introduction of Belt and Road. On the security front, I look at UN peacekeeping operations, that China's support for those that has increased in these regions over time. Also at conventional arms sales, and those have been quite minimal other than in the 80s with the Iran-Iraq war. You had a major uptick with China selling arms to both sides in that conflict. But since then, you've really had a very minimal level of arms sales. Anti-piracy, they've been involved in multilateral anti-piracy activities since 2008 in the Gulf of Aden. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, they established their first overseas base in Djibouti. It was announced in 2015 and then established in 2017. The book also looks at Belt and Road, which really encompasses many of these other foreign policy tools that I've discussed. I'm not going to go into detail on that today, but that is another issue area that I look at. So now that I've discussed the foreign policy tools broadly, I want to give you an idea of where these fit in on the spectrum of competition to cooperation and from divergence to convergence with the liberal international order. So the first block of foreign policy tools that I want to highlight for you would be ones that are competitive with the US. And in my work, primarily the economic, political, and foreign aid foreign policy tools tend to fall in the competitive side. So those tools that are competitive with the US and diverge from the liberal order, right? So examples of that are the cooperation forums, the political focus on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the very strict interpretation of Westphalian sovereignty. That's in tension with the broader liberal international order. On the economic front, the heavy state support for Chinese businesses and for these interactions, I also would categorize as divergent from the broader liberal order. That tends to fall in the areas of investment, bilateral financing that China's providing, a lot of the infrastructure development, et cetera. I also put foreign aid in the cooperation forums, but also more broadly in the divergent category. That tends to be around the issue of political conditionality. So it does differ from a US and Western approach of wanting to have progress on good governance and other internal issues. So that would be the primary divergence there. For the special envoys, the aspect of that diverges from the liberal order, I would say, would be the Syria envoy and its very strict interpretation of sovereignty and wanting to discourage foreign intervention in Syria. Some other tools that I would put in the divergent category are government support for Chinese companies more broadly. And as I've said, foreign aid. And then on the UN Security Council, the votes associated with a very strict interpretation of sovereignty, I would put that into divergent. So you have a number of tools that fall into divergent. We also have a number of economic, political, and foreign aid tools that fall into something that I call norm neutral, that I don't really see that there's a liberal international order norm associated with it, but it's very prevalent in China's behavior. The tools that I put into that norm neutral category are special economic zones, agricultural demonstration centers, strategic partnerships, as well as the Djibouti base. And happy to talk about that in Q&A, but all of these, I don't think there's strong norms associated with it. I see them being as competitive, but I don't see them as being divergent from the liberal order per se. Next, I want to talk about tools that I see as competitive with the US, but actually converging with the liberal international order. So this would be in the cooperation forums. I would say the focus on South-South cooperation is something that's very convergent, with the liberal order more broadly, as far as supporting other developing countries, et cetera. I don't see that as diverging. And then support for the Palestinians in the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I put that in convergent because China's approach on that is wanting the parties to use multilateral mechanisms through the liberal order, in particular through the UN, to resolve that conflict. So I put that in the liberal, the convergent category. On the economic side, although a lot of the stress on China's behavior tends to be about the divergent elements, in the cooperation forums and in their broader behavior, there's a number of economic activities that very much converge with the liberal order. Some examples of that would be facilitating tariff-free trade with less developed countries. That's something that's very much promoted and encouraged by powers around the world, and I would say is very much in alignment with the liberal order. Pursuit of free trade agreements. This is it's allowed under the World Trade Organization to have these type of regional agreements. It's very much facilitating free trade and that aspect of the liberal order. And then also China's behavior in multilateral development financing. And what I mean by this is their interaction, whether it be the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, or working with the World Bank, or working with other multilateral organizations, they do provide quite a bit of funding, et cetera. So I would put that in the convergent category. Other foreign policy tools I would put in convergent would be the special envoy for the Middle East, for the same reason that I discussed earlier, primarily focused on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but wanting to use multilateral mechanisms to resolve that issue. Also, the special envoy for Syria, the aspects of that focus on the multilateral piece of resolving that conflict, whether it be on a regional basis or through the United Nations, I put that as convergent. UN Security Council voting regarding Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where that diverges from the US, again, because of the multilateral piece, I would put that into convergent. And finally, free trade agreements, which I've already mentioned under the cooperation forums. Those I think squarely fit within convergent. So as I've said, on the political, economic, and foreign aid side, you've got a lot of competition, sometimes inside the order, sometimes outside the order. There's a very distinct difference between that and what we see on the security front in these regions. In these regions on the security front, I see all of the behavior as being both cooperative, The base in Djibouti you could put into the competitive space, but the other mechanisms I would say are cooperative with the US and the West and are convergent with the liberal order. So the security cooperation, the cooperation forums, I would put in that category. The special envoy for Africa that was attempting to resolve Darfur and South Sudan, that very much was conducted in cooperation with the US and the West and through multilateral mechanisms. UN peacekeeping operations squarely fall within the liberal international order. Anti-piracy has been conducted in a multilateral way with Western countries. And finally, conventional arms sales around the norm of non-proliferation, the very limited arms sales that they've been engaged with. I would also put that in the convergent category. So I've discussed this difference in the two functional areas. Another thing I want to discuss briefly would be how China is differentiating itself as a great power with these tools in these regions. So it presents itself as a defender of sovereignty, as a champion of development and South-South cooperation, as a promoter of connectivity, all different kinds of connectivity with these regions, as a supporter of multilateral institutions to resolve conflict in particular, but also in many economic spheres, presents itself as a balanced actor that has positive relations with all states in these regions, whether it's the Arab states, Israel, Turkey, Iran, states throughout Africa, etc. They really present themselves as being a balanced actor. And finally, they emphasize their lack of a colonial history, in contrast as they portray it with Western states. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do is give you an introduction to what are China's interests in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, ways, thinking about it from a competitive and cooperative standpoint versus convergent or divergent standpoint, thinking through, is China building an order? And if it is, what are some of the characteristics of that order? And finally, how China portrays itself as a great power. And I do want to say a few words about what this could indicate about China's rise globally. What I'm finding is that China is not attempting, in these regions, is not attempting to maximize power, but it's also not entirely socializing into the liberal international order. Its behavior varies across functional areas in the ways that we've discussed. Competitive on the economic, political, and foreign aid front, sometimes in the liberal order, sometimes outside it. In the security realm, cooperative and primarily convergent. It's building significant multilateral mechanisms to interact with these regions, especially through cooperation forums. And all of the foreign policy tools I've described today are similar to what China is implementing through much of the developing world, especially in areas outside of its own periphery. So finally, to restate my overall argument before we move to Q&A later, although China doesn't seek to change the international distribution of territory in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, as its power grows, it increasingly competes with the US, builds spheres of influence, and challenges the rules of the international system by constructing an alternative international order to facilitate interactions. Although China does not yet seek to replace the international order, if the current order unravels or China is excluded, the alternate order it's building could serve as a foundation for its economic, political, and military interactions with the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the rest of the developing world. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dawn Murphy. Indeed, for those, sorry, that was extremely clear. And for those who joined just after my introduction, Dawn Murphy just presented her book titled China's Rising in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative Order. Before we move on to the second book, I just wanted to remind those who are listening us that they can submit their questions in the chat, and then eventually I will read them after the second presentation, after we will discuss probably at least one of my questions. But now, without any further delay, Adam Grydehøj, Ping Su, they're going to present their book titled China and the Pursuit of Harmony in World Politics, Understanding Chinese International Relations theory. Adam, Ping?
Thank you so much for having us here today. Is my screen shared correctly? Oh, excellent.
It is.
You know, I'll just start out by saying how much we enjoyed reading Dawn's own book, which is a very different than ours. She has such a breadth of expertise and depth on these issues. Our own book, on which this presentation is based, is much more focused on actual theories of international relations coming from China, as opposed to policy. Su Ping and I came into this topic actually from a research involving island societies and small island states and territories around the world, in which we noticed sort of divergent ideas, divergent interpretations of what Chinese and the United States and various European countries foreign policy actions actually meant. I won't be speaking about this in this presentation, but it's something that we might have the opportunity to talk a bit about in the discussion. So in this talk, we'll be focusing on what the concept of harmony means in Chinese international relations theory today. This isn't a discussion of all forms of Chinese international relations theory, but just on a particular an element of it, which is worthy of discussion. The book on which all this is based takes a decolonial perspective, which is somewhat unusual for this kind of text. But we start with this understanding, with this idea that if you want to understand why someone does what they do, we have to understand how they view the world. That it's impossible to have some kind of objective, unsituated idea of what actions mean to different people. You don't have to agree with what another political actor is doing, but if your intention is to understand the reason why someone is doing something, then it's good to know what they actually believe, and thus what their cultural context is, where people feel that they themselves are situated. And that's sort of the starting point for our study of Chinese international relations theory. Now, what's interesting here is when you look at the sorts of IR theories which are coming out of China itself, and there are various ones, and we just discuss a few of them here and in the book. It's really evident that the concept of harmony is quite prominent in a lot of them, and many of the Chinese theorists are claiming that they use harmony in a traditional way. That harmony is maybe the cornerstone of Chinese culture. It's been around since ancient Chinese thought. And that it's important to take maybe a traditional Chinese perspective on the way that politics works around the world, and that they're going to take a Chinese perspective here. This sort of raises the question, of course, as to what a traditional Chinese perspective of harmony actually is. And where it gets complicated is that there isn't really any one single traditional Chinese perspective of harmony. There's more than what I'll discuss here, but we could identify a few different prominent and distinctive views of traditional ancient ideas of harmony, which get reflected in present-day Chinese international relations theory. For example, just at a really superficial level, we could look at Confucianism, in which harmony tends to be described in these ancient texts as involving a recognition of difference. We have to understand that not all things are the same, and that harmony involves being able to manage with difference rather than to attempt to force things into unity. And that we can maintain relationships through custom and through laws and through understanding what proper relationships ought to be. Really significantly for the discussions in terms of the IR theory, there's a dyad of other care and self-care, the idea the famous Confucian concept that to raise up yourself, you have to raise up the other as well. That benefiting others benefits you, although really prominently also within Confucianism, it's also sort of famously based on this sort of family structure and a kind of hierarchical structure. The idea that, of course, there are some relationships which are more important than others, and there's some to which you have a greater duty of care than others. And this differs quite significantly from the school of thought that's often referred to as Moism, which has a lot of different elements, but the most important for us here is the idea of impartial mutual care. Whereas Confucianism would argue that there are certain actors to whom we ought to extend greater care, to which we have more duty than others. This idea here is that we have a duty of care to everyone in the world. Some would say equally. And one could also look at a Taoist philosophy, which involves the world itself being full of harmony. The natural order of the world, of the universe, is harmonious, and that thus to act in harmony, to act harmoniously, is to follow the natural course, which of course can be quite convenient if you're saying that what you're doing is natural course anyway. But the idea that natural action, good action, is harmonious in itself. And what we see is that these different ideas come to expression in different ways in a number of international relations theories. And often, as Su Ping will speak about in a moment when she's describing these theories, we see that these different, rather divergent conceptions of harmony from ancient China get mixed together or get deployed in strategic ways by theorists today.
Among the major Chinese schools of international relations theory that have emerged since the early 2000s, three present themselves as rooted in traditional Chinese conceptions of harmony and seek to provide specific Chinese perspectives on world politics. These three theories are 天下, which means all under heaven, 关系, which means relational, and 共生, which means symbiosis. 天下 theory, introduced by Zhao Tingyang, emphasizes the idea of great harmony under heaven as the ideal social order. Zhao believes the world can only be understood at the global scale, not at the subordinate national scale. His 天下 rests upon the principle of excluding nothing and no one, including all peoples and all lands. There is no foreign or domestic, no self or other. No country could possibly be successful in a failed world. The world's universal well-being takes priority over that of the nation state. 天下 is not a word system of imperial dominance or hegemony. It's not the application of harmony through force. 天下 as a process of harmony, diversity, and cooperation is not incompatible with the current international system of sovereign states, but it can only be achieved if it rises above these states. Thinking with a word naturally produces a world institution of governance. 天下 theory envisions a world institution capable of maintaining world peace, interests, and order for all peoples, harmoniously and equally. And this world institution is all-encompassing rather than absolute. 关系 theory, developed by Qin Yaqing, takes its starting point in a positive opposition between Western and Chinese ways of thinking and acting. Western international relation theory prioritizes the ontology of existence and thereby emphasizes individual entities and their self-existence, self-interest, and egoist action, while Chinese thought focuses on relatedness, coexistence, and the existence of the self in relation to others rather than existence in isolation. According to Qin, all social actors, including politics, are relational, and the world itself consists of relations. This affects our perception of choice and strategic activity. Unlike Tianjia's theory, which sees all interests as shared by all peoples and states through a network of universal and uniform relatedness and equality of difference, Guanxi theory regards all interests, identities and powers as constructed through an actor's relations with other actors. So coexistence and existence are mutually constitutive. The one does not precede or deny the other. Rather than conceiving of political actors as independent entities trapped in existential conflict, Guanxi theory sees them as mutually constituted and mutually empowered relators. Guanxi theory emphasizes relationships of reciprocity in which actors raise themselves by benefiting others. For Qin, rationality is necessarily secondary to relation, given that the self cannot exist without others. There can be no rational self-interest, just relational shared interest. The third theory, Gongsheng theory, advocated mainly by Ren Xiao and Su Changhe, seeks to offer an alternative to Western international relation theory. Gongsheng scholars use ancient Chinese diplomatic practice and political thought to explore the historical significance of a symbiotic international system in ancient East Asia, and encourage the present-day construction of a symbiotic international system to replace the Western-dominated system. Gongsheng scholars emphasize the pluralistic nature of the world and argue that ideological and cultural homogenization are both undesirable and impossible. States should seek symbiotic peace, harmony, inclusiveness, and cooperation rooted in acceptance of difference. The Gongsheng system sees states as mutually dependent, not merely coexistent. Although the Gongsheng approach does not assume symbiosis as a universal attribute, it believes symbiosis should be the goal of international society. Cooperation and harmony are superior to competition and chaos.
Thank you so much. When we look at these three theories, it's quite interesting, as all three of them claim to be focused on ancient traditional Chinese conceptions of harmony, but all of them conceive of harmony in quite different ways, and they're not all cooperative. Let's say there are some clear contradictions between the approaches that these different theories would involve if put into practice. In our book, we do look briefly at the way in which Chinese international relations theory has developed in interaction with the policymaking community in China and with Chinese society. And we would say that the theorists we're discussing, and Chinese scholars in general, are well aware that when they're discussing harmony and traditional ideas of harmony, they're not necessarily discussing exactly what Confucius believed. They're not trying to replicate ancient models, but they're using harmony as a tool to make their international relations theories more accessible to Chinese policymakers, more acceptable within Chinese society. It's sort of a shorthand for showing that your ideas fit well with the Chinese mindset. But since harmony can mean so many different things, since the concept of harmony is so flexible, it can be used and deployed for many different purposes. A key point in all this is that these theories all seem to sort of attempt to encourage the Chinese state to live up to what they are arguing are traditional Chinese ideals. So the idea that if the state is going to be Chinese, then it would be nice for it to take Chinese type activity, as the authors of these various theories, as the researchers perceive them. And what's significant here is that the various theories are saying that states ought to act harmoniously, but they're largely not arguing that China itself is uniquely harmonious. They're all claiming that these are perspectives which are grounded in traditional Chinese philosophy, traditional Chinese viewpoints, and maybe it's easier for Chinese scholars to write about them and think in this manner, but they're not actually making claims about the Chinese state and Chinese foreign policy as it is now. These theories are not straightforwardly being used to support or to criticize the Chinese state. They're all activist in a way, though. None of them are supporting the status quo of world politics. And this gets a little bit complicated in as much as often, I mean, we believe that international critics are frequently misunderstanding these theories as sort of claims to cultural superiority. And it could be sort of evident where this comes from, because if the idea of harmony is supposed to be a good thing, if everyone loves harmony, right? But if at the same time you have these assertions by the theorists themselves that harmony is something that the Chinese in particular hold close to their heart, it could look like some kind of pro-China boosterism, and there might be an element of that, but when we're reading these theoretical works, we also note what we see as sort of a conscious attempt at distancing the idea of distancing themselves from the idea of a kind of unsituated Western IR theory, the idea of an IR theory that has no culture whatsoever, that has no cultural grounding. Of course, when it comes down to international theories in international academia, claims of not having any cultural grounding usually means, in fact, that we're having a Western or a European or an American cultural grounding. So rather than these being claims to cultural superiority of the Chinese, they're more claims to cultural difference. We also note, and here we get it slightly into a policy area, but that when we see these theories influencing policy announcements, policy proclamations by the Chinese state, we often see discussions about the other care and self-care dyad, the idea that we all have to work together to achieve common goals. The success of one depends on the success of all. We have to help others. If these are being viewed as a binary, other care and self-care, then there's the very real risk that Chinese policy pronouncements, which may or may not work out in practice particularly well, but that the policy pronouncements themselves look suspiciously selfless. The idea that we just want to help others, we just want to be lovely toward the world. What we argue is that when you're looking back at the theoretical roots to this, these policy positions are not necessarily being understood in a selfless way in China. It's going with the idea of the importance of mutual care. So our overarching argument in the book, and I suppose in life in general, is that Chinese and Western researchers should do their best to strengthen intercultural communication, that it's important to try to understand where others are starting out, if you want to understand why they're acting the way they do. And again, this doesn't mean that people have to agree with all the policies that China or any other state is enacting, or have to agree with the ideals of any other state, but it's just a good idea to try to understand where those ideals are situated. Thank you all so much for listening. We're really looking forward to participating in the discussion.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Sue. So we just heard Adam Grydehøj and Sue presenting their book on China and the Pursuit of Harmony in World Politics, Understanding Chinese International Relation Theory I could see a few members of the audience joined recently. Before we heard Dawn Murphy talking about her book, China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa and Beijing's Alternative World Order. Please, as I said a few minutes ago, do send your questions in the chat, in the Zoom chat, and I will read them. Before I go through some of those, I just wanted to ask a bit of an academic question, which you have already touched on it. Perhaps it's useful to ask this again to bring us all together into the discussion nicely. It's a question I often ask my students, and it's two questions really, but they are the same question. So I often ask, should we look at China through the lenses of IR scholarship or through the lenses of the sinologists? And who is the most qualified person, the most appropriate profile to look, to study China, right? Let me just rephrase this. Is there anything specifically Chinese? That's what I'm thinking of. Is there anything specifically Chinese in the way China is rising, in the way China does its foreign policy business? Or China is just, at the end of the day, just like any other great power, like the US during the Pax Americana, the US Germany, like Britain before? I guess I know where you might stand, but I was wondering whether I could hear some of your views on this question, if you think is a useful question. If it's okay, I will start from Dawn and then we'll go back to Adam and Sue.
So actually, I think both are important, right? From the standpoint of, I think both really give a lot of leverage and understanding, especially in the regions that I look at, China, Middle East, China, Africa. In my own work, that's part of why I try to situate it. I think especially obviously within the US, interacting with however you want to label it, American, Western, IR theory. I want to be making that type of contribution, right? Which is part of why I'm looking at kind of offensive realism versus, more liberalism. And ultimately, as you guys, I'm sure could tell from my findings, tend to be very much in alignment with power transition theory, even going back to Gilpin's work. So I do think that looking at China without theory could be problematic, right? Because then you're just having an empirical study. But I think also to actually start to understand the behavior, it's very important for sinologists to be looking at not just the theory piece, but what China is actually saying about what it's doing. And so a lot of my work tends to look at the formal declarations and how China is portraying it and how, elites are viewing it, et cetera. So I think part of what we do miss is taking China at its word at what it's doing and then trying to understand what that means, right? Not coming in with certain assumptions from theory or from policy stances, et cetera. So I think marrying the two together is incredibly important. And then of course, not just sinologists, but I do think having Africanists and Middle East specialists and, increasingly China has a global presence that I think it's very hard to understand China's behavior in these regions without looking at it from a more local perspective. So I think we're in a very exciting time of studying China's rise that all of these fields can come together and contribute. But on the question of, is China just like any other great power? I think from an IR theory standpoint, from a Western IR theory standpoint, yeah, probably. I don't think that, but I think it's important. Every great power has a different set of values, a different set of norms. So dependent on who the great power is, especially if you're interested in international order, that can have, their values, their priorities can create very different, aspects of order, et cetera. So I think you have to consider both together in thinking about China's rise. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Donna. I guess, yeah, great powers might have very similar long-term trajectories and objectives, although sometimes the way these strategies are operationalized, how you get to that objective might have an impact also on where you're trying to get and on the implications that this has on others. Sorry, Adam and Sue.
Sure. Yep. Thank you so much for the. It's a fantastic question, and I think it goes to the heart of a lot of what we're trying to discuss. One thing is that China itself obviously isn't just some homogeneous mass, and China isn't just one thing in itself. Of course, this is one area in which some of these theories that we're discussing can get into trouble. Because they not always, but often treat the idea of harmony and Chineseness as something very specific. But more generally, it's a bit difficult to answer this question, because I would say not only can we just say that all great powers have different perspectives, but also that it's important to begin by recognizing that we're all situated somewhere and we're all taking some perspective to start with. It's impossible for I believe from our perspective here to make some kind of a statement as to China is different from the other great powers, whereas we would be tending to say that all actors differ from one another in some kind of fundamental way, and that regardless, in fact, of the extent to which China is some homogeneous mass, or we could speak about the United States, what matters more might be whether or not people believe that they exist, whether or not the people who are enacting policy, people who are thinking about international relations, believe that there is such a thing as China, believe that the Chinese nation is one thing, that the United States is one thing. I don't know if Su Ping has anything to add to that.
Thank you, Adam. I think, well, every time if a Western scholar asks this kind of question, and I deny that China actually has a very different maybe purpose, or I deny that, well, it's not the hegemony that it will seek, that the other scholars would be very suspicious and would not be convinced. So it's get a little bit, well, complicated, because I think it's totally different culture. Also, we have different perspectives. Like in this hegemony, the concept of hegemony, I think it's a very Western concept. Along with the capitalism and modernity, and all those things we don't actually have previously. Before we actually also accepted this and learned this concept from Western countries. So I think China has a very different understanding of modernity, and it wants to maybe go beyond modernity. Although we think a lot of Chinese scholars, they believe that maybe although it's very important to for the economical development and to achieve complete modernization, but it's something that we should go beyond, because modernization as a Western concept, it's not a totally positive thing. And well, so the many scholars, and also China, I think, is trying to seek a new form of civilization, a new type of civilization, and something that's very different. Maybe that's go beyond the concept that if a country gets stronger, then it would certainly seek hegemony. There might be some other possibilities. So that is the thing I believed. And also I think well, to understand this, people need to understand the culture, because usually if you have different systems of epistemology, usually you would look at things differently. So we think maybe there might be some other possibilities and some other forms. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, yeah, I agree. In a way, I agree with you. And it's possible that, for example, if we look at China's military strategy, although this sounds like a cliche, I still see Sun Tzu as being very relevant to how China deals with its military affairs. But on the other hand, I think China lives in a world that, as you said, where perhaps there are Western values, where there is this idea of hegemony. And I'm convinced that while the West, although people don't like to admit that over here, but while the West has been influenced by China in many ways, I think it's possible that China will be influenced by how the West operates. And so also its military strategy makers are already thinking a bit more like strategy makers in the West. And so there you have perhaps the effort. We don't know yet to what extent, how far that will go, but this effort to build a Mahanian type of navy. Even if China was different, I wonder whether being in this type of international system where we've been for centuries, it has an impact on those theories of harmony. But anyway, there are some questions in the chat. Some are addressed to Dawn, so perhaps eventually I'll ask another question to Adam and Sue, but there's also a question for Adam and Sue. So perhaps I'll start from the one for Dawn, and then I'll go ahead by asking a question myself to Adam and Sue. So Rachel, from undergraduate student from the University of Hong Kong, is asking Dawn whether she has come across any Chinese diplomatic strategies that falls into those categories that violate the liberal values internationally, but that nonetheless are collaborative to the US, or perhaps I'm adding, are perceived as positive, as collaborative to the United States. Dawn, don't know if it's...
Yeah, and this will actually be a fairly short answer from the standpoint that in the foreign policy tools that I've looked at, and something I think is kind of interesting is those are the two kind of blank on that kind of grid I was talking about, those being, that's the blank piece, right? The cooperative with the US, but also diverging from the liberal order. So I have not. That said, I'm looking at a distinct set of foreign policy tools. There are very well maybe ones out there that would fit into that category. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I don't think of any, but I think it's a great question. I think it's an area for further research and thinking through that, right? Because in some ways it intuitively makes sense that perhaps there's, because the liberal order in many ways reflects US interests and US values, and when the behavior is diverging from that, potentially kind of in essence, it ends up being cooperative, it ends up being competitive. And then on the, yeah, so I'll leave it at that, but no, I have not, but thank you for the question. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Dawn. And I don't know exactly right now off the top of my mind, perhaps I can just add something. And I don't know if this violates liberal values, but certainly from the point of view of my research, this battle over mercantilism between US and China might be interesting in the sense that, I mean, the United States itself often has bended the rules of the liberal international order, especially from an economic point of view. But I don't know if this falls into violation of liberal values that Rachel is referring to. I'd like to ask a question to Adam and Sue. There will be a question on audience for all the speakers later on. So if you could please avoid that for a minute. Adam and Sue, I wanted to ask you, I sense that there's growing interest in the kind of theories, on the kind of theories that you presented today. I was just guessing, I was curious, and perhaps I appreciate there might be not just one answer here, but I was guessing, is this because we see we get to know more China-based scholar or more successful Chinese and China-based scholar? Is this because in the West, inclusiveness has become an important value? Or is this a measure of China's soft power, the fact that Chinese theory of international relations are more and more discussed in our discipline, international relations theories? I can just think of some colleagues over here who work with that.
Thanks so much for the question there. It's an interesting one, and there certainly is more discussion of this out there. Part of it might simply be that more is being published in English now, which makes a difference. But it might also be maybe Ping could give her own thoughts on this, but it might also have to do with the changing way in which Chinese theorists have been treated in the public sphere in China as well, and in the political realm.
Are they more
yeah.
more sought after? Is that what you're saying?
What's your impression of this, Ping?
I think in China, well, actually those theorists, they are very influential. Their theory has affected the foreign policies of the government, and they sometimes would work with the government as well. But the Chinese theory, well, in the international field, I think is still not so well known by other scholars from other countries, and it's well, it's something that those scholars, they are trying to maybe to promote the Chinese theory in the international field, in the international academic field, so as to maybe to make the Chinese theories and the Chinese policies better understood by other scholars. And I think there's still a long road to go. On the one hand, a lot of the Chinese international relations theorists, I think they're not very get used to writing in English language. And we do have several influential scholars. They could write and publish in the English language. Well, but still there are many other scholars who has this difficulty and problem. So they are more tend to give their voice in the domestic context. So maybe there's that is why China is also encouraging scholars from different languages majors to translate those Chinese books and Chinese theories into the major language, English language, so that they could be better received, to increase the understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I don't know, Dawn, you wanted to perhaps add your impression on this? Like me, you will have seen that there's been a growth in interest in this area. I don't know if you had any personal point to add.
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Yeah, and so yes, and it's interesting you say this, because I think at the same time with this common prosperity campaign of Xi Jinping's, clearly there's a tension there, right? I think it's important for a country like China, as for as it has been for the US, to get up there the way of thinking. But on the other hand, I wonder whether the current political trend in China might actually prevent that from happening. I don't know whether this will have an impact on just on the scientific sector or technological sector, or whether this will also affect social sciences. There is related to this, partly related to this, there was a question on in the chat about audiences. So essentially, I'm not sure if this is a colleague or a student, but from Leiden University, Elena, who is in the area of Asian studies, is asking all of you, who are the audiences, who is the audience of your books, of your works. Then specifically for Adam and Sue, she's adding, due to their highly interdisciplinary background and co-authored nature of the monograph, she's saying that the desired audiences can be different, but not necessarily discontinuous. What are your audiences?
Okay, so my audiences would be so scholars and students of international relations, right? Chinese foreign policy, African, Middle Eastern foreign policy, et cetera. So I see that within academia being, both obviously scholars, researchers, and then students. But then I also, a major audience for my work would be policymakers broadly, right? So whether that's US government, or if that's in the UK or Australia or China, et cetera, more of a policymaking audience. And then obviously when I say IR and other studies, not just within the US, but more broadly, but those would be the primary audiences for my work.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is a really thought-provoking question. I mean, yeah, for my own part at least, I would imagine that things get complicated as much as it's a book about China in English, which draws to a great degree from Chinese language a material, much of which isn't available in English. So I guess we would partially be looking to reach the international IR community, but also within the international Asian studies. But for me, at least personally, something that's really important is that although the book is in English, we sort of hope that it can have some impact within the Chinese academia, because a large part of the book is about intercultural miscommunication and about the ways in which certain theories and concepts are not translating very well. So that maybe by having some of these sorts of discussions taking place in English, we could prompt different kinds of thinking in the Chinese scholarly community, and maybe also policy-making community, about communication strategies that aren't working necessarily.
Adam, so can I just briefly ask a follow-up question? Those you said earlier on, you said that those theories that you presented, there's a tension between them. I was just wondering whether this tension is reflected somehow, carries on in the policy debate, or before finding a synthesis. Does it have any impact, any implication? I'm just guessing.
I hate to give you all of the hard questions, Ping, but do you have any thoughts on this?
Do you mean the tension of this theory in China?
Yes, I wonder whether this is just this tension remains on a theoretical level, whether it's something we would see also in the debates between Chinese elites, or that discussion only stays in the academic sphere. Basically, that's what my question is pointing at.
I think that those theorists, Chinese international scholars, are very outspoken, and they try to make an influence on the society and in the public field. So they're not only working as a scholar, a lot of them as public intellectual, and they usually actively promote their theory, and they try to also use their theory to influence the government policies. So I think it's what they want to achieve.
I mean, for my part, you know, when you look at the responses by individual scholars, so other Chinese scholars who are maybe working in more specific policy related research, there you could really clearly see sometimes influences from particular IR theories, Chinese IR theories. When I look at the government pronouncements in a general sense, I do note a kind of synthesis sometimes, which is also rooted in this idea that these theories themselves have synthesized various previous thoughts.
Thank you both. So there's a very broad question. It's for Dawn, but I think all of us can try to answer it. And I think it takes us back to my first question and perhaps the tension that there is between the two works that have been presented today. I'm not sure about the name of the person. I have a question for Dawn. Yes, so I was wondering what is the current liberal international world order, but then there's a follow-up question saying, or it's just the US leading world order. I think that's an important question because it might sound like a basic question, but actually I think it really takes us at the bottom of the tension between US-China relations and between China and the West. Dawn.
So when I refer to the liberal international order, and I didn't discuss this in my presentation, right, in detail, right, but I'm discussing two major aspects. One would be on the political side. So obviously that would be democracy, human rights, utilizing multilateral mechanisms for conflict resolution, you know, going through the UN, et cetera, right, on the political side. On the economic side, I'm primarily talking about free trade, open markets, and limited state involvement in the economy. Although the US was heavily involved in the creation of the order and benefits from it greatly, I do see US behavior as distinct from it, from the standpoint, and I think Rachel's question earlier and Zeno, your comments associated with it, that actually highlights an aspect of that, right? Because you do have many areas where the US itself is diverging from the liberal order. You mentioned protectionism. So that's one I was thinking through after you made that comment. That's one where I think China and the US's behavior is converging in that they're both diverging from the liberal order, but they aren't doing that in cooperation with each other. They are doing that partially to compete with each other, right? There's a number, and this is again is why I tried to move away from revisionist versus status quo, because there's many ways. If you think about responsibility to protect or armed intervention into other countries for dispute resolution, et cetera, there's a number of areas where the US has been diverging from the liberal order. You know, even you know, over time, we have sometimes had less of an emphasis on our alliance structure or multilateral, you know, mechanisms, et cetera. So I do think the two are distinct, although often the liberal international order reflects US or Western, you know, values. But I think that that is definitely one of the tensions. And I think that hopefully that answered the question. I think they're related, but I think it's really important to look at specific behavior on all these different issues, because sometimes China is very much in alignment with those liberal values, and sometimes it is not. And my own work doesn't look at domestic governance as much, but that's one area also where there is some pretty significant divergence that ultimately may be impacting China's global behavior. So I don't equate the liberal international order equals the order the US wants, but the two are related in certain ways.
Thanks, that's very interesting. Just made me think that it clearly is a US-led order, but one of the features of the US hegemony is that it has to give away some of its power because it's ruling by consensus as well. So clearly, is not just the order that the US wants, but it also needed to be, for the hegemony to happen, a liberal international order. So I agree, but obviously this liberalism often clashes with the most realist story of American grand strategy. Adam and Sue, I think this question, from a Chinese perspective, I guess it's very important. What would be a Chinese perspective on whether this is a US-led order or not?
Yep, you know, it's part of the trouble. This also actually goes back to part of the difficulty in translating and internationalizing Chinese IR theory, right? Is you have the creation of sort of false divisions that the Chinese theorists, also when looking at world politics, have to start out by saying, well, we're going to take a Chinese perspective, and that sort of locks everyone else out from the discussion, from being covered by it. Whereas at the same time, let's say an American or a Western order perspective gets taken as some kind of universal standard. I'm not sure to what extent it makes sense to speak of a single world order having a single name, because this again takes some kind of standard baseline. I don't know. The Chinese theorists who we're looking at do speak about the existing order being strongly influenced and sculpted by the West, and you have to look at alternatives. But within the actual theory itself, as opposed to the policy scholars who are then deploying this theory within China, you actually don't find all that much creation of this kind of giant order-based binaries. Is my own feeling, at least. I don't know how Ping feels about this.
I have to say that the Chinese public and Chinese people, they generally are not so confident about the role of China in the world order, and they still believe that the United States is the very most powerful country and leading the world order. And while China is trying to maybe to make some changes in this, but still there's I think a distance. This is what I usually when I look at some Chinese social media and look at the chat rooms, and a lot of Chinese people, they actually they believe that China still have to work hard to maybe to make progress. Yeah.
Thank you, Adam and Sue and Dawn. I'm afraid we need to close the session. I just wanted to conclude with a phrase, very controversial one, that one can find in the final page of Adam's and Sue's book. But I think Adam knows what I'm thinking at, probably. But I think is relevant also. Even the last question we tried to answer, and Dawn was talking about mutual divergence from the liberal order of the US and China. So Adam and Sue are saying one person's wolf warrior foreign policy and death trap diplomacy, maybe another person's pursuit of harmonious world and community of common destiny. The same objectives and activities can be justified and interpreted in different ways. I think it captured the tension that ran through this session today. I thought it was extremely controversial. However, I think it contains a truth if we look at the current international order, international events. And the truth is what Dawn was saying, this mutual divergence in different ways. I mentioned the B3W of President Biden earlier on, the campaign of common prosperity in China. And I think perhaps if I can make a critique of the West in this regard, I think in Western circles, this truth, although very controversial, hasn't been appreciated, processed, or accepted for too many years. Accepting doesn't mean necessarily agreeing with what Adam and Sue have just written, but I think it means that political elites, Western political elites, need to begin to think more realistically about both the domestic and external trajectory of China's grand strategy. They're starting to do that, but we didn't do that for too long. I think we failed to acknowledge that for quite a long time, and we see a lot of tension nowadays in the UK, in Europe, in Australia when it comes to China. Doesn't look good, tensions between the US and China, but on the other hand, I think there are healthy debates going on in this regard, because actually what wasn't healthy, what was for me completely unrealistic, it's what we had before, and this idea that, you know, by trading with China would have democratized and become more liberal. So I think I can say, especially because in a few days we'll have the 50th anniversary of the meeting between Nixon and Mao. Perhaps a degree of pragmatism it's welcome. Hopefully will be helpful in the coming years. I think I'll leave it here, and I'd like to thank everyone who have listened to us over the last hour and a half. Heidi, Sid, the University of Oslo, Dawn, Adam, and Sue. It was great to read about your work, and even better to listen to your presentation today, because I could appreciate even more your arguments. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day, and keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.